Another kind of field research is participant observation, which is not detached at all. This is the kind of research where the researcher or people they have hired to work for them really get into the heart of what's going on. They observe the face-to-face interaction of subjects by immersing themselves in their lives, usually for a good period of time. And doing this is supposed to allow them kind of like an insider's view on the behavior or whatever it is they're studying. It's supposed to provide a much more deep and sympathetic understanding of motivation behind the behavior. Maybe it's just me, but I always picture somebody, living with some ethnic group living in little huts. But in all seriousness, absolutely participant observation could be used to study a particular ethnic group. It could be used to study the homeless, somebody living on the streets for a period of time. So instead of just questioning them, the researcher would actually live with them. It could be it could be used to study the families of young patients with a chronic illness. Moving in with them and living with them to understand their daily stressors. It could be used to study single parents. Again, maybe moving in with them or spending most of every day with them. In a way, the researcher takes on the role of the person they're studying. They become part of their environment. So you would take down really extensive notes in order to kind of get an inside picture of what you're studying. So participant observation is not detached at all. The textbook uses the unfortunate and the horrible example of mass shootings in schools to demonstrate this. That after these events occur, and things are just beginning to settle a bit, researchers have, more than once, spent time in these schools and with the students and their families. They've spent time with the teachers, with the neighbors of the shooters themselves, and sometimes even with the shooters' families. And they've done this in an attempt to understand why the person did what they did, and also to optimistically try to prevent it from happening again. The shooting at Columbine High School in Columbine, Colorado on April 20th, 1999 is a good example of this. And by good example, I mean from a research participant observation perspective. On that day in 1999, two students who are not pictured here, these are pictures of the victims, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, killed these 12 students and a teacher when they entered the school and began firing, and they also injured 21 people. Both of the boys committed suicide at the end before SWAT teams entered the school. One shot himself in the temple and the other through the roof of his mouth beside each other in the school library. Since the Columbine shooting happened so long ago, it's hard to believe it was almost 20 years ago, because I remember when that happened. At this point, the length of time that's passed has allowed a great deal of research to be conducted regarding Columbine specifically. And unfortunately, since school shootings have happened more than once since then in those situations as well. Now with Columbine in particular, because it was kind of like the first big school shooting that gained a lot of attention in the States, participant observation research was used specifically regarding the social climate at that school and other schools, regarding this theory that this goth subculture that was associated with the shooting somehow also helped to cause it. This was used regarding the effect of video games and music, because it was theorized that violent video games and certain kinds of music, because the two shooters were big fans of Marilyn Manson, maybe that somehow had something to do with their motivation. And research was also done regarding the reaction of authorities and how the response to the shooting was handled that day. For example, this is a little bit off topic, but not really. When the Columbine shooting took place, the SWAT teams arrived at the school and they didn't go in. They waited. There was all these rumors that the two students had rigged the school with explosives. And indeed there were explosives, although the vast majority of them never went off. But there were even students inside the school texting, "I'm bleeding to death," or "Somebody's been shot beside me and they're bleeding to death, please come in." And authorities still waited. So one of the first lessons learned from Columbine was that when these things happen, there's no waiting, you go in. That's in order to help Buddy, but it's also to get a hold of the shooter and stop the shooting as quickly as possible, and that's what takes place now. Now, as stated in the textbook, the research that's been done since Columbine actually shows that only a very, very small number of students, a very small number of young people, look at media violence and then translate that into their own violent behavior. After Columbine occurred, this was one of the main theories. It's because of violent video games, violent TV, and it's this music. So even though, at the time, some conservative groups in the United States very, very vocally blamed violent video games and movies and music for putting negative ideas into the heads of kids, research determined that these things were not really a factor. Instead, what research has indicated, participant observation research, after the fact in Columbine, but also there was really an explosion of research regarding youth culture, the social climate of young people, researchers going into schools. It's indicated that students who have a tendency towards this kind of behavior usually have a weak connection to their school, a weak connection to their community and their peers. In other words, as Emile Durkheim would explain it, they do not have a lot of social solidarity. And this conclusion was reached due to the work of several different researchers from several different disciplines, not just sociology, but including a sociological perspective, who did not approach this from a detached observation perspective. Instead, they met with people face to face, stayed in the communities. They didn't even attempt to remain detached. Now, as with anything, participant observation has its advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, this method allows a researcher to really get to the heart of a subject, to really get inside an inside perspective that is rich in detail that you simply cannot get with only observation. This allows them to gain an understanding of the respondents in a way that other research methods just will not allow. Their perspectives, their motivations, maybe their feelings and emotions and attitudes. This is a picture of Jane Goodall doing her research with chimps, by the way. This is why when a researcher is exploring a topic, when they do not have an absolutely specific focus or an absolutely specific research question in mind, using participant observation is especially valuable because it provides such rich data. On the negative side, participant observation has the possibility of not being viewed as valid research because all of the data is collected through the eyes of the researcher, and that bias is a danger. So because participant observation generally involves taking really extensive notes and writing down your own impressions, your own views can come into play and bias in terms of how you perceive things, what you write down. So think of it this way. It's not the participants' responses that are recorded. It's the participants' responses as heard through the ears of the recorder, who is the researcher. So this researcher might become so involved with subjects and so sympathetic to the group of people being studied that they completely lose objectivity. Even if they don't want to be completely detached from the situation, as a researcher, a certain amount of detachment is needed. You have to be able to maintain at least some objectivity, but that may be lost. So it's not unreasonable to feel that field notes are not always reliable because they lack independent confirmation. There's nobody else to verify what the notes contain. In an experimental situation, somebody else can try to replicate the results by following the experimental procedure, the experimental method. But with this method, with participant observation, it's not possible. So you can't recreate the exact same situation again. And in addition, Because the researcher, the observer, is also a participant in whatever is going on, reactivity becomes an issue again because it's easy to influence other people's behavior just by observing them. And obviously, the people who are the subject of participant observation research are going to know they're being studied. So just as with detached observation, a group of homeless youth or the families of young patients with a chronic illness or single parents may alter their behavior, either purposely or even subconsciously, not even aware that they have, because they know they're being studied. So all of that is field research. And the last research method we're going press the wrong button. The last research method we're going to talk about is analysis of existing documents and official statistics. So we're still on step 3, selecting a research method, but this is the last one. Yes, this is research. Although when people hear the term research, it's probably the last thing they think of. But this absolutely is a really important method of research in sociology that's used very, very often. This is called non-reactive research because there are no actual people involved. The researcher does not interact with the people being studied at all. This refers specifically to the analysis, for example, when we talk about existing documents, of maybe diaries or newspapers or published historical works, and yes, statistics produced by government agencies. But all of this is created by people who are not the researcher. In other words, with a lot of this, it's created not for the purpose of sociological research. Existing documents usually are not, but official statistics are. And I'm going to give you an example to demonstrate why, even though the researcher is not interacting with an actual person, this method is really valuable. So this is a picture of Barkerville, British Columbia, a long time ago. And I put this up here because I want you to think about a community event in regard to diaries. If you think of a diary, it probably sounds odd, if you're not familiar with this, to think of analyzing somebody's diaries. But keep in mind, I'm not talking about the kind of diary that little girls are sometimes given with a little gold lock on it to keep their mums from reading it. Diaries of interest to a sociologist might be those, for example, of historical significance. So, let's say a sociologist or researcher wants to study social events that occurred during a particular period of time or in a particular community, because they would then provide an indication of the level of social solidarity in that community. So, let's say we're looking at Barkerville, British Columbia in the year 1900 to 1910. How often would there be community events? Who would organize them? How many people would or would not attend? Were there any people mentioned in these diaries or records that seemed to attend all of them or none of them? What kinds of events seemed to garner the most attention and the most people attending? What kinds of things were these gatherings based on? Were they always religious holidays or seasonal events like, the harvest or planting? Where would they occur and what would occur at them? So just off the top of my head, having never conducted this kind of research myself, these are the kinds of issues a sociologist might be interested in. A sociologist might be interested in studying the diaries of combat veterans, for example, to gain a better understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder and their experience of it, as well as what supports should be put in place to better assist them. To come back to an earlier example, a sociologist might be interested in the diaries of parents looking after a chronically ill child to gain a better understanding of their first-hand experience with the healthcare system. So the list of possible reasons why a personal diary might be of interest to a researcher can go on and on. And there's lots of existing documents a sociologist might want to take a look at. Birth and death certificates, marriage licenses, baptismal records or other religious records, burial records, school attendance records, church attendance records. They could be more employment-based records, such as transportation logs or annual reports of some kind. They could be a usage log, meaning usage of a service like a hospital or something like that. And all of these can interact with each other. For example, comparing the age of a woman at first marriage in Canada in the 1800s to her age at death and number of children. So all of this would have to do with maternal health and the high death rate of women in childbirth at that time. Now, if you're looking for existing documents, you might go to the Ontario Provincial Archives. I've actually been here. I did 2 days of research here about 25 years ago. Very, very interesting place. When you go in, it's basically a great big, large, very quiet library. Just as a side note, you are not allowed to bring any kind of pen actually inside once you sign in. You can only use pencils because they're so careful about ink not damaging anything in any way. And these are the National Archives of Canada. I've never been there, but I imagine they'd be very similar. And when you go in the archives, believe it or not, sometimes you are allowed to make contact with original documents. Let's just say I want to look at the, I'm going to use an example in a minute. I'd like to look at a diary from this priest who was in this location in 1925. And they'll actually let you look at the original document. Sometimes, however, I think most often, the picture on the right is a microfiche machine. And what's happened is somebody's had the really exciting job of scanning millions of pages of documents into microfiche. And so you get, it almost looks like negatives. That's what I'm trying to think of. Negatives. When you used to get pictures developed and you get a negative, you can see in the little box on the right beside the microfiche machine, it's like negatives and you look through them. And then the picture on the left, this is often what you have in the archives. So it's just like going to a library and you need to search for something and then you follow the numbers and find what you need. Now, I think most often, the most commonly thought of example of a researcher making use of statistics published by government agencies is Statistics Canada. Usually people call it StatsCan, and I think it's just because we all have a difficult time saying statistics all the time. I didn't realize StatsCan wasn't formed until 1971. Just happens to be the year I was born. I thought it was older than that. And the purpose of StatsCan is producing statistics to better understand Canada in various ways, which doesn't sound like a very exact purpose, but it absolutely is an important purpose, which I'm going to explain. So, it wants to understand Canadians, first of all, better, and our economy, and our culture, and our society in general. The head office of StatsCan is in Ottawa, but they have satellite offices all over the country. Not in every city, but, you know, kind of here and there. Every 5 years, StatsCan conducts a countrywide survey focusing on a wide range of issues about Canadian life. And if your household receives it, by law, you have to complete it and send it in. This is the census. And you might remember something a few years ago around 2010 on the news regarding the cancellation of the long form census and a change from mandatory participation to voluntary participation. And maybe you remember seeing something on the news about some people being really, really up in arms about this and frankly freaking out. And like most Canadians, you probably didn't understand what the big deal was. Now, particularly with, where am I? So this was a proposal, like I just said, that you don't have to complete it. Now, the problem with doing this, getting rid of the long form, making it much shorter, and not making participation mandatory, is that the quality of data collected by StatsCan would have really taken a nosedive. Many of the groups that disagreed with this proposal were concerned also that a voluntary system of completion would affect the quality of data. So, if participation is not mandatory, that means there's going to be a lower response rate. Likely a much lower response rate, let's be honest. And as a result of that, there was a lot of concern that underrepresentation would occur for several groups. For example, newly arrived immigrants would not complete it. Maybe the senior population would not complete it. There was concern that Aboriginal peoples would be underrepresented in census data. And when you look at how census data is used, then you'll understand why not being represented properly on the census is a big concern. What is the point of collecting all this stuff anyways? I have answered this question more than once for students, and even though personally I don't deal with statistics, and I've answered it more than once with adults in my education of sociology classes, and just in conversation. Especially when the proposal was made to get rid of the long-form census, people automatically thought that was great because it would save the government money. But it's used for very specific purposes. This is a picture of the North Bay Regional Health Center. I just call it the hospital, which opened within the last 10 years, I think. Census data would be taken into account when deciding if a new hospital is needed in an area. Census data would be taken into account when deciding if a highway should be left as 2-lane or expanded into 4-lane, which has happened in Northern Ontario. Census data would be taken into account when deciding whether a new school should be built, when deciding if more funding is needed for childcare or senior care in a particular area. So these decisions are not made on census data alone, but it absolutely is used to help plan public services. So census data helps to recognize employment trends, trends in family formation, such as the number of single-family homes, how many of those are headed by women and how many are headed by men. It would establish how many Canadians continue to be legally married and how many are living together without a marriage ceremony. The demographic and statistical data collected by StatsCan also is used to determine, so here it would determine things like crime rates in each region, helping to determine how funding is allotted for crime prevention. A lot of people don't realize that this data is also used to determine the number of members of parliament for each province and territory. So all of this further then explains why the long form census and mandatory participation faced such strong opposition. Now, there are huge advantages to making use of existing documents and official statistics. Mainly that they can save you a boatload of time and money and effort. As I've said more than once, research can be really expensive to conduct, but with existing documents, obviously that's all taken care of. And keep in mind, it isn't like just anybody can walk into a statistics, that's why we call it StatsCan, a StatsCan office and access the data like they have. They take confidentiality and privacy extremely, extremely seriously. You usually have to apply for permission and for whatever information you want because StatsCan recognizes this is highly, highly sensitive material. So for a researcher though, finding what you need at StatsCan, that can be a researcher's equivalent of finding a gold mine. Not just because they have it, but because the stats produced are of such high quality. Really, really big sample sizes, larger than any independent researcher or research organization could even hope of creating for themselves. And then this can be generalized to represent an entire population. StatsCan generally uses really rigorous data collection procedures so that the data collected has a high degree of validity. It's highly reliable. To put this in layman's terms, it's really accurate, really good data. Because StatsCan is such a huge organization with access to large financial resources, it's able to do this. And as the researcher, you can benefit from it. And in addition, reactivity is clearly not an issue because you're not dealing with actual people. But if there's a good side, there's a bad side. And as with other research methods, making use of existing documents also has certain disadvantages. If you're making use of stats already compiled by a government agency, then as a researcher, you haven't created the questions in the existing documents yourself. So all you have to use for analysis is what's in front of you. You can't provide your own input for what's included in a StatsCan census. You can't make sure that questions are asked in a particular manner, or even that certain questions are included. All you can do is look at what's been done and make use of it, even if it's not exactly a perfect fit for you. And as the textbook points out, on one hand, it's great because it's almost like the researcher has skipped the first steps of the research cycle, and instead you're just starting with analysis of data. Now, if you're making use of diaries or historical documents, I'm going to state the obvious. You can't ask the person who created them any questions, so you can't seek clarification of any kind. Again, what you have is what you have, and that's it. You can't ask for more detail. You can't ask them what they meant when they wrote something. You can infer, you can make an educated guess, you can suggest a direction for further research, but that's all you can do. And because of this, this is a huge limitation of using existing documents no matter what they are. It's like you're bound by the parameters of somebody else's work, like you're being restricted by the information you're using. Another problem with using existing documents is bias. Not yours, but the researchers. So let's say you're reading the diaries of priests who lived and worked in Quebec from 1900 to 1929. Remember, 1929 marks the official start of the Great Depression. And you're doing this because you're trying to determine if religious commitment before the Depression affected religious commitment during the Depression. In other words, once the Depression really hit and life became much more difficult, did people turn to religion more for guidance? Or did those involved with their local church have the same level of involvement beforehand? And you've decided that referring to church records of attendance, as well as the diaries of the priests at this time, is a good approach. This is the research method you've chosen. But when you're reading these diaries, how do you know that the priest's observations are accurate, or complete, or unbiased? Priests are people. They like certain people and families more than others, just like everybody else in the world. So maybe they even did this subconsciously. They wrote more positively about a family and more often about them because they liked them more. Their personalities just hit it off, they meshed. But maybe a priest wrote more negatively about a family, or simply didn't refer to them at all because they just rubbed him the wrong way. Their personalities did not mesh. So something that a researcher needs to keep in mind when using existing documents in their research is that the documents might be biased to begin with. And this is a bias that the researcher might have absolutely no. How do you know it's going to exist? It's just there. Even if using logs or records of some kind, maybe an error was made entering the information, you never know. So when the choice is made to use existing documents, you have to really consider all these factors and take them into consideration when you make any conclusive statements based on your research. Okay, so just because that was a lot of information for this one step, we have 4 research methods. We have experiments, surveys, field research, and we have existing documents and statistics. That was all step 3. Step 4 is collecting data, and this is going to be short and sweet because collecting data is just that. You do what you said you were going to do. If you're going to do the interviews, you do them. If questionnaires, you do them. If you're going to do participant observation, you go out and do them. That's just collecting data. You do what you have been planning to do. You're collecting the data. And that's it for step 4. Step 5, analyze the data. You would think this would be simple, and often it is. But sometimes it isn't, because one reason is the researcher might discover something that is completely unexpected. They might discover something they predicted was incorrect. And I'm going to go back to the example of the shooting at Columbine High School in 1999 as an example of this, because the research conducted at Columbine and in the aftermath of other school shootings actually disproved a popular belief about what motivates shooters. As I've said, right after Columbine, everybody, and by that I mean society in general in both Canada and the United States, was really caught up in this concept of bullying. And society generally believed that the prime motivation of the two shooters was that they had been horribly, horribly bullied. And as a result, they wanted to get back at the high school establishment as a whole. That they were seeking revenge for being bullied on the student body and the teachers. This was a commonly accepted conclusion, a widely accepted belief. But research actually disproved this, as I said. All research indicated it's not that bullying is the main motivating force behind mass school shooters. Instead, it's a lack of social connection, as I stated previously. Now, is bullying likely a part of this? Absolutely it is. Or some other kind of social exclusion. But it's not the only motivation, and it's not the prime motivation. Instead, research determined that bullying is part of a much more complex explanation that usually involves years, not just a short period, of the shooter feeling they simply do not belong, that they don't feel a connection to the community as a whole, to the people around them in their immediate social environment. And various kinds of research conducted by various people disproved the common belief and the expectation that bullying was the main motivating factor. Now, if you're interested in Columbine in particular, there is a great book available about what occurred at the high school that I've read twice that doesn't just focus on the shooting itself, but really provides an organized, comprehensive analysis of everything that occurred in the shooters' lives and how that led them to do what they did. And it's just simply called Columbine. This is not an academic book. It's not a textbook or anything. So it's a very easy read. It's very interesting. It also does include an extensive analysis of how the shootings occurred minute by minute, which is frankly difficult to read. The response of the authorities, how the community responded in the immediate aftermath, and in the years following, as well as how the shooters' families dealt with it. How do you deal with that as parents? So the book is simply called Columbine, written by David Cullen. Yes, and it's written in everyday language. It's not an academic book. Then another book that's come out about Columbine that I haven't read myself, but it's on my list, is called A Mother's Reckoning, Life in the Aftermath of Tragedy. Sue Klebold is the mother of one of the boys who participated in the shooting. And it's received very, very positive reviews. And by reviews, I realize this is sensitive subject matter. I don't want to be insensitive to that. But by reviews, I mean that giving you another perspective, so to speak. So I think it's important to point out that disproving your theory, that not finding what you expected to find or what you predicted, is okay. That is the point of conducting research. To find out about something, to potentially find the answer to a question. You might not find the answer you expected to find, but you still find an answer. And with this in mind, if a theory or hypothesis is disproved, a researcher must be prepared to let go of that and acknowledge it, because this is the purpose of doing research. So analyzing data, a researcher may have their hypothesis disproved. Now, here we go. Last step, report results, the last level. It can feel like crossing a finish line at the end of a long and arduous race. You're done, so you report your results. If you're hired by a research company, a research organization, you will prepare a report for them. If you're conducting research for academic purposes because of an MA or PhD thesis, then you'd have that bound at the university. I remember bringing my MA thesis in to be bound and being very underwhelmed at the response I got. I thought people at the counter would be happy with me. For them, it was just another day. So you have to get it done. I mean, you have to bring everything together. For some, it can mean actually submitting it to an academic journal for consideration for publication. And it's pretty common, actually, for a PhD thesis to kind of been reorganized and submitted for publication. This lets others in your field know what you've been up to, how you did it, and what the results were. But this necessarily means that your work will be scrutinized, analyzed, and criticized by other people. This is in fact what you did when you reviewed the literature, when you reviewed existing research. You didn't just look to see what had already been done so that you didn't end up replicating it if you didn't want to, but you also examined how previous research was done so you could learn from their mistakes as well as what they did that worked well. And that's what researchers do. If you find an error in how someone else selected their sample for a survey that ended up biasing results, then you do things differently. If you find a question structure or an approach with questions that worked particularly well, you did the same. So when you publish your own results, that is what others are going to do with your work. And that's okay. It's expected. It's part of the game, so to speak. If you're going to conduct research, you do so knowing that it will be picked at by others. And this may sound a little bit philosophical, but when researchers publish their work, they really are contributing to this kind of vast knowledge about it. And overall, that's the whole point. You're finding out new information, or connecting information, or making observations with the intent of you learning something new. That's the whole point. There's no point to conducting research and keeping the results to yourself because it would be a waste of time. Here we go. All of this began with looking at research methods. So I began by looking at ethics in research, and I gave you some examples of that with these 5 key issues focusing on informed consent. And then the research cycle. First thing you got to do is formulate a research question. You've got to know what your focus is. Then you're going to review existing research. And as I just said, you're going to learn from other people's mistakes, replicate it on purpose, or avoid replication. And you've got to figure out how you're going to do it. So before you even select a research method, you've got to keep your time and budget in mind. And then one option is an experiment. And there are several issues that you need to keep in mind when conducting an experiment. There are surveys, and just as with an experiment, there are several issues that you need to keep in mind when conducting a survey. Field research, whether detached or participating, has their own issues. Analysis of existing documents and statistics. This is non-reactive because you don't interact with people at all. And then you're ready, set, go. You collect the data, you analyze the data, and you report your results. And that is research methods from a sociological perspective. So I hope this has all made sense. I hope it hasn't been too dry for you because I know research methods can be. First chapter is done. Next chapter we're proceeding with culture, which I think you'll find interesting. And please don't forget to complete the quiz for this chapter online.